which is important in this world today, is it has lots of data and provides insights with that data on careers and job opportunities. That is, where Daniel comes in. If you think about what Daniel does, is he leads the research team that uses Glassdoor's unique proprietary data, right? And that data is you all, in a good way, right, are feeding, right, that data. Employers are feeding that data. And what we get from that, and this is what's so important, is data is important. Like as a researcher, who uses data, it's very helpful to have that data to be able to think about what are trends, what hypothesis can we test from that. And so if you think about what he's looking at, he's looking about labor trends, he's looking at things about employee and employer relations, which are only going to get more important in the future. As we think about sort of AI is, we had a nice conversation about that earlier, how AI is coming into the workforce and what trends are we seeing? They will be some of the first to see those trends. And as we talked about, it won't be hype because it'll be based on data. Lots of times what you see is a lot of hype around where is labor going, what's it doing. One of the things we talked about hype, can I share that real quick, is, yeah, you all remember the word prompt engineer. Not out there anymore. Nobody talks about that anymore, actually. So what's hype in the news and what's actually grounded in data is really important, especially in this stage and age where it is difficult sometimes to separate hype from actual results. So thrilled to have you here. He is also here because he's the 2006 Kenan Institute Distinguished Fellow, and he is spending time with us today as, I hope you've all heard, we have a new grand challenge that we're really excited about. And the grand challenge is renegotiating work, which I think is relevant to everybody, and balancing workplace demands and our favorite word, uncertain times. And I think we're just at a moment where uncertain times, we can get rid of that and just say times. Because I'm not sure we're ever going back to, certain times. The world is uncertain times, and let's just get used to it and learn how to live through it, because that's the world we're in. His work covers a lot of different aspects, but in particular, one that here at Kenan-Flagler, we're particularly interested in, because we've done an employee survey and we're really interested in engagement. And so he's focused on employee engagement, employee sentiment, which I think is really important. And he's also produced new products, such as like Glassdoor Employee Confidence Index, right? And so being able to understand at a macro or at a grand level what's going on with your employees is so important, because there's the conversations we have that bring context to it, but then there's also actually we need the data and the stories to tell the same thing, right? It's not one or the other, it's a yes and. So his research spans transparency, really important, employee retention, layoffs, AI's impact on the labor market, and leadership communication styles. We could talk later, okay? So I'm eager to hear Daniel's insights. I had a fantastic short conversation with him, which makes me even more excited to hear your insights. And please help me in welcoming him. Can't wait to hear from you. Thank you.
Can everybody hear me? Yes? Okay. Thank you for that very kind introduction, and to everybody at the Kenan Institute who has helped put on this event and helped organize this event. I'm really glad to be able to speak to this audience today. So so I'm going to be talking today about what workers want. And we already got a little bit of an introduction to Glassdoor. If you're not familiar with Glassdoor, it's a platform where you can gain insights on career, on companies, on jobs. Most people know about Glassdoor as a place where you can leave reviews or salary information about your employer and also get some of that in return. So the first thing I want to talk about, and is kind of like a framing point as we think about what workers want and what's going on in the job market right now, is that there is a lot of need to distinguish between what is real and what is hype. There's a lot of noise around what is actually going on in the job market. There's a lot of emphasis on like these buzzy trends, and like prompt engineering, I think, is a great example of something where there was a lot of hype around it. Was it actually borne out in the data, or did it actually happen? Doesn't really seem to be the case. I think another interesting and important framing question here is about what is the same versus what is the different. I think there's a lot of a temptation to say, oh, this time is different. We're living in unprecedented times. Like we need to throw out the old playbook. We need to throw out whatever we thought in the past, and we need to come up with something brand new for the future. And I would say that in general, my belief is that that's not really true. So a lot of the things that workers want are similar today compared to what they wanted in the past. There are, of course, some nuances. There are some differences. But by and large, there are a lot of things that are the same, and it's important to really try to resist that temptation to say, oh, everything is different, everything is new. So to give a little bit of context about what the current job market environment is like, I'm sure anybody who reads the news, opens up their news app, they see a lot of these headlines, right? So you see things like, oh, the economy is slowing down. The economy is slowing down. You see hiring stalling. You see news about layoffs and workers getting anxious about that. You see trade policy. You see other policy changes. Return to office is another big stressor that we hear about from workers. And of course, because we are in 2026, we have to talk about AI. And AI is something that shows up in terms of driving worker anxiety as well. So there's a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of potential factors that could be affecting what workers want in this current moment. And that is actually something we do see in Glassdoor data where workers are feeling pretty down about the current job market. So we have something called the Glassdoor Employee Confidence Index, which is this monthly data product that basically just looks at Glassdoor reviews. And in particular, there's a question in there about the percent of employees that have a positive 6-month business outlook for their employers. And you can see that starting in around the end of 2022, that number has really sharply declined and then has remained low since then with a few wobbles here and there. The other thing to point out here is just the level. So I don't know if you can see the most recent data point there, but it's at 44% as of February 2026. So that means that less than half of employees actually have a positive 6-month business outlook for their employers. That's not a great level. That's not something that as an employer or a leader you want to hear. You don't want to hear that for half. Okay. Can you hear me still? Okay, all right. So you don't want to hear that less than half of your employees rather, actually continue to believe that your business will be successful. That's not a great place to be in. So that's a little bit about, the current state of the job market and the economy that we're in. But I think it's also important to reflect on the information that we're in. Okay. It's also important to think about that information environment and the media and kind of like the stories that we get here. So for example, you see a lot of these phrases in the news, these kind of like 2-word buzzy phrases that try to describe how workers feel and what they want right now. So I think the most obvious example, or kind of the first example of this trend from a few years ago that I noticed, was quiet quitting. So that was kind of a popular phrase a few years ago, and that's kind of all of these other phrases as well. So quiet cracking, revenge quitting, quiet firing, and coffee badging. There's a whole host of the other phrases. I think, as I was prepping for this presentation, I just Googled what are some of these other phrases. I couldn't find a good headline for it, but I saw office peacocking, which is apparently the practice of going into the office and showing off that you are in the office compared to your peers. So I think these buzzy phrases are really designed for virality, right? They're really designed to try to get you to think that this is new and fancy and worth going viral. But a lot of these trends are actually just a reflection of kind of basic behaviors that you already see in the workplace. So if you go back to quiet quitting, it's what does quiet quitting actually mean? It just means a worker who is not putting in 110% effort in the workplace. It's somebody who's maybe putting in 90% or 100% or whatever, which is not really an unusual phenomenon. As long as jobs have existed, there have always been people who have said, okay, well, I'm not going to put in more work than I'm being paid for. It's hardly a novel concept, right? And so again, this is, I think, a useful framing point because there's a lot of noise out there, especially in this current environment where we're talking about AI, we're talking about all these fast changing trends. It's important to keep in mind, like some of these things are probably going to be hype, and we want to separate that noise from reality. So one example of this, if you remember a few years ago, there was all this discussion about the Great Resignation, right? So this was back in 2021, 2022, there was this big uptick in the quits rate. More people were quitting their jobs, they were resigning their jobs. This chart here shows the quits rate from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And there was a lot of discussion about the idea that this was being driven by this radical rethinking of how workers relate to their work, right? Workers don't want to work hard anymore. They want to focus on work-life balance. They're not as motivated. They're not as ambitious, right? And that actually shows up in some of the headlines from the time. Peter Coy at the New York Times quoted a few of them in this opinion piece that he wrote. And I think my favorite here is the second one. We've become a nation of quitters. Which to me honestly seems kind of ridiculous. And I think you hear this characterized as nobody wants to work anymore. And if you actually compare this like idea with the data, you find that it's really not true. So for example, on the left-hand side here, the chart here shows the employment to population ratio for workers aged 25 to 54. And the right-hand side shows the labor force participation rate, which is the same as the left-hand side. It just includes people who are also looking for work. And in 2021 and 2022, those numbers rebounded very quickly from their COVID lows when naturally they were low because of the pandemic. And in fact, over the last few years, they have been near their highest levels since 2001. So this idea that nobody wants to work anymore is patently ridiculous. And if you were to look at the story around the Great Resignation, if you were to look at that story and think like, oh, well, nobody wants to work anymore, people have radically rethought their relationship with work, you would actually be off, right? You would be missing what is actually going on in the data, which is that we actually had a surprisingly tight labor market in 2021, 2022, and we've had, maybe the story is everybody wants to work more so than in the past 2 decades. And this is something you see in Glassdoor data as well. So this is an analysis that we did basically every 2 years, so 2017, 2019, 2021, 2023. And we're looking at Glassdoor ratings and the various workplace factors that predict overall employee satisfaction. And you don't need to worry too much about the exact values here, but the order of these workplace factors has really not changed across those time spans, right? So the 3 most important factors in our data for predicting employee satisfaction are culture and values. So do you have a healthy workplace culture? Senior leadership, do you have leaders that you believe in, that you have confidence in, that you think will be able to guide you well? And then career opportunities, like do you have opportunities for career? So those have not really changed at all in terms of their order. And this is all coming at the same time that people say, oh, Great Resignation. Oh, people are really emphasizing work-life balance, right? And in fact, you see actually third from the bottom here, work-life balance has not really changed in terms of where it sits amongst its peers. Now, that being said, if we're thinking about the framing question that I posed earlier, how are things the same versus how are they different? It's true that work-life balance has not really moved up or down this list, but the way that we talk about work-life balance is different today than it was in 2019. So the most obvious example of this is remote work. Remote work is something that is much more prevalent nowadays than it was in 2019. I personally think that is a structural shift that is here to stay despite some of these like return to office statements and trends. So the way that we talk about work-life balance is a little bit different, even if work-life balance has not necessarily shifted in terms of relative importance compared to some of these other factors. Now, okay, so remote work is a little bit different right now in terms of how it's something that workers really want. And because of the economic environment that we're in, we are seeing more employers push back on remote work as well. So there's this disconnect between what workers want and what workers are actually getting. And one place that we actually see this in Glassdoor data is if you look at the top right panel there, the blue and purple lines are the career opportunities ratings for workers who are remote or hybrid. And you can see that those career opportunity ratings have declined pretty substantially compared to the pink line, which has been more stable, which is workers who are not remote or hybrid. So I think what's going on here is that there is this disconnect between what workers want and what workers are getting. Employers are making the trade-offs between flexibility and career growth much more stark. So that can appear explicitly. So for example, an employer might say, hey, if you don't come back to the office, you are not going to be eligible for promotion. Or in the most extreme case, you're going to be laid off if you don't actually comply with these return to office policies. But that can also show up in implicit ways as well. So for example, you might have a employee who is up for promotion, and if they go into the office, like maybe they're rubbing elbows with the C-suite or with the executives at the water cooler, that sort of thing, and very naturally will get a little bit of a bump in the likelihood of their promotion, whereas somebody who's remote doesn't have those same opportunities. And that bias, maybe in a tighter labor market, employers would have a little bit more incentive to try to really make sure they're being equitable. But in a world where the job market is a little bit weaker, there's a little bit less worker power, there's less incentive for employers to really pay attention to remote workers and building remote culture. So that's kind of a little bit of a discussion about flexibility and kind of where the state of affairs is there. I want to pivot a little bit and talk about leadership as well, and kind of through the lens of engagement in the workplace. This is really thinking about ideas around are people still as ambitious, or do they still want to be as engaged with their employers? So I think that the motivation for this, as we were talking about some of the grand challenge ideas, is this idea that workers might be becoming more transactional. Like, are workers really disconnecting from the traditional like corporate grind? Do they not believe that climbing up the corporate ladder is really a path to success anymore? And so there are some ways where you see this disconnect showing up, where you see workers and leaders having these gaps. In particular, you can just look at Glassdoor reviews that mention disconnection. So if you look at Glassdoor reviews, these kinds of keywords like disconnection, distrust, hypocrisy, misalignment, miscommunication, like these are all phrases that are becoming a lot more common in Glassdoor reviews that discuss leadership. But I think, we've got to be careful about extending this claim to say that workers are looking outside of management as a path to success, or again, that this is a radical change in the relationship between workers and management. Yes, this is an indication that workers are disappointed, but it's not necessarily evidence that workers are eschewing the idea that management is a path to success. And one reason that I bring that up is actually like we got a request maybe about a year ago from a reporter who said, do you guys have any data at Glassdoor about this trend called conscious unbossing? Which, when they first asked the question, I was like, I have no idea what you mean. And, they explained this was the idea that Gen Z is consciously choosing not to be on the management track anymore. That Gen Z is, they're not ambitious anymore. They don't want to rise the corporate ranks, or maybe more charitably, it's like Gen Z wants to pursue side hustles and they want to pursue these other avenues to career success rather than becoming a manager. So this was kind of news to me. This was not an idea that I had been very familiar with when they approached us. And so we actually took a look at some data, some government data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And what we found is that there's really no sign of this whatsoever. So if you look at Gen Z and how likely they are to be in management at a given age, they are tracking exactly the same as what we have seen in past generations. And this is, I think, a nice little aside that we can have here, where one of the places where you see the biggest difference between like hype or virality or like these kinds of buzzy stories in the media versus what you actually see in the data, one of the biggest places with this disconnect is anything that talks about generational differences. And I'm sure everybody in this room has probably seen stories about millennials or Gen Z. Oh, you know, they're so apathetic, or oh, they job hop too much, they're so disloyal, or oh, they're buying too much avocado toast. Like this, it's a very lazy target, in my opinion. Generational divides tend not to be very meaningful. You have like a 15-year period where you have a generation group together, and there's a lot of change within that group. So if you look at Gen Z, for example, let's say somebody graduated in 2019, they found a job, and of course COVID was disruptive, but they're right. Or if you have somebody who graduated in 2020, just a year later, well, then they would be graduating into a very different situation. Maybe their job offer got rescinded and they really struggled to find something after that. And then you could have somebody who graduated in 2021 or 2022 when the job market was a lot hotter, and they could have had a great experience where they found a job instantly, they had multiple competing offers, and they were able to negotiate a raise. And then somebody in 2023, 2024, 2025 graduated into a softer job market and have had a worse experience as a result. So technically, those are all people in the same generation, but in the span of just a few years, they would have totally different experiences with the job market and totally different preferences based on their experiences. And so it's really hard to say that they're I don't think it's really appropriate to lump them all together and say that, oh, they're all just the same. They all have like the same, like, I don't know, psychological idiosyncrasies, right? So in practice, I think that it's always good to have like a little bit of healthy skepticism whenever you see somebody make claims about, with a broad brush about a whole generation. The next slide is actually just a little bit of a tangent. It's another chart that came out of this analysis, which I just think is kind of fun, which is that if you look at Gen Z, as of 2025, they made up 1 in 10 managers in the workforce in the US. And in 2026 or 2027, they're projected to overtake baby boomers as a share of the labor force that is managers. So, you know, for those of us who are not Gen Z, I think it's just a reminder. We're getting older, and the kids are not all kids anymore. So, you know, again, this is all to say, like, okay, what do workers want? Is it really that different from what we've seen in the past? We see that workers are rising into management at similar rates. And if we go back to the first slide in this section, we were talking a little bit about disconnect and how people are feeling a little bit disconnected from their leaders. Well, we can kind of flip that around and look at the things that workers talk positively about in their Glassdoor reviews about their leaders. So emotional intelligence is emotional intelligence phrases are things that increasingly appear in Glassdoor reviews talking about leadership. And so you have phrases like employee well-being, empathetic leadership, respecting boundaries, addressing burnout, providing clarity, addressing uncertainty. Like all of these ideas around emotional intelligence are things that workers do want and are asking more of their leaders. So this is a case where I do think that things are different. The bar on what constitutes good leadership has been raised. So this is an area where I do think that there actually have been changes. And I think this is also an indicator, again, that we are not entering a fully transactional relationship where employees are just looking to their employers as a place to get a paycheck. They just want to get their 9 to 5 and get out. No, workers actually want more emotional intelligence. They want their leaders to care about them. They want their leaders to treat them like humans, which, you know, seems pretty reasonable. And there are other places that shows up as well. So for example, when you look at mental health. That has absolutely been a topic that has come up a lot more in Glassdoor reviews and from employees. And I think this is actually really interesting. This chart on the right here, it's looking at benefit reviews on Glassdoor and which benefits have seen the largest increase in reported by employees. Work from home as a benefit is number one, no surprise there because of the expansion of remote work. But number two is actually mental health care. So since COVID, mental health care is the benefit that has seen the second largest increase in access. And I'm not trying to say that like employees are expecting that employers are going to be their primary source of well-being, but it does indicate that they do expect their employers to invest in their well-being, whether you're talking mental health, whether you're talking sorry, whether you're talking about mental health care, whether you're talking about emotional intelligence, whether you're talking about just having a healthy culture in general, things that these are all things that employees expect from
Still hear you,
yeah, okay. It just sounds like it's cutting out up here. Okay.
but you've got my
Okay.
projection.
Okay. All right. Great. Thank you. So a culture again is a place where employees want a little bit more of a relationship with their employers, and so I think again this is to push back a little bit on the idea that a transactional relationship is enough for workers, or that's necessarily what workers want. And I think one way that I think about this just intuitively is, okay, well, let me imagine what a transactional relationship with work might look like. It's like, okay, I show up at the office at 9, I leave at 5, I don't talk to anybody, or I don't particularly enjoy talking to anybody, so I just get my paycheck and I go home. Well, that sounds kind of boring, honestly, or not very fun. And so if I'm spending all of that time at the office, I would much rather be working in an environment where I actually like the people sitting next to me. And so, humans are social creatures. I think ultimately people do want to be in a culture and in an environment where, they might not necessarily be having fun at work, but they might at the very least enjoy being around the people that are around them. So yeah, so the next topic I want to talk a little bit about in terms of what workers want is the topic of layoffs. Obviously, this is something workers do not want. So the flip side is maybe a better way of saying this is that they want stability, they want security. And this is actually a good moment again to talk about this difference between hype or noise and reality. Layoffs, of course, have been in the news. It feels like if you open your news app, you can't avoid seeing a headline that says like, oh, there's been another major employer that's laid off 1,000 people, 2,000 people. And so let's level set on what the data actually says. So this is data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. The most recent data from January 2026 shows that there were 1.6 million, roughly, layoffs in that month. And that's, the last few months have been a little bit lower, but really it's been tracking between 1.6 to 1.8 million, which is about where it was in the 2010s. So in the 2010s, I realize the text is probably really small there, but in the 2010s, the average was about 1.8 million per month during this kind of long but gradual job market expansion. So layoffs are not really in recessionary territory right now. They're not even in like downturn territory. They're more maybe in a more normalized state. So the other thing to look at here is actually to look at that level. So 1.6 million people, that's a lot of people. But that also helps you put in context some of these headlines you see. If you see a headline that says, oh, this company is laying off 10,000 people, that's a lot of people. That's a lot of people impacted. That's less than 1% of the monthly layoffs in the US each month. So that's kind of a state of affairs of what the data says about where layoffs are trending. But at the same time, how do workers feel about it? And this is another place where Glassdoor data can step in. And if you look at the share of Glassdoor reviews that talk about layoffs, it's through the roof, right? It's actually higher now than it was during the peak of the pandemic. And again, that's not to say that we think that layoffs are actually that high, but clearly this is a topic that workers really care about and are really anxious about. And so what are some possible reasons for this? One of them is that maybe the shape of layoffs is changing. So this is data from WARN Act notices, where if a company has to lay off a certain number of workers, they have to file a notice with the government. And what we can see here is that there's been an increase over the last few years in some of these smaller layoffs affecting fewer than 50 workers. And so one possible explanation for this is that we're seeing more smaller layoffs rather than fewer large layoffs, right? So maybe instead of a company laying off 1,200 workers at the start of the year, they trickle that out into 100 workers each month and end the year at the same headcount, right? But in that kind of context, you're really against what workers want or don't want, right? Workers don't want uncertainty. They don't, and they do want stability. And one piece of research that one of the folks on our team, Chris Martin, did on layoffs has, I think, found some really interesting data about the effects of layoffs on culture over time. So this chart here shows the trend in Glassdoor ratings after a layoff, represented by that dashed red line that's vertical there. And this is tracking over 2 years after the initial layoff. And you can see that a company's ratings are still lower 2 years after the layoff, which really, I think, goes to show you kind of how long the impact can be on culture. And this is also not just about people who were let go and are upset and leaving bad Glassdoor reviews. In fact, if you look at this red line here, that's for employees who identify that they are current employees, which means that they are we are identifying them as essentially layoff survivors, people who are still at the company. And you can see that you still have this pattern where there's actually a sharp drop at the start of the layoffs, and that number continues to remain low after the fact. And so if we think about this idea that maybe there are these repeated layoffs, these smaller layoffs, one other thing that Chris looked at in his research was to actually look at cases where we had multiple layoffs in the data set. And he did find that subsequent layoffs do have this stacking effect, where if you do have multiple layoffs, the impact actually gets a little bit worse each time. And one other point I'll note here in terms of like putting this in the context of what workers actually do, right? Like we've been talking a lot about what workers say, and obviously you should listen to what workers say, but what workers do is also a really great indication of how they actually feel, right? And so one thing we do see is that you can actually link users on Glassdoor. If they left a review for a company that had a layoff, what's their behavior afterwards? So we can say this user said, okay, there was a layoff at my company. I was really upset, and now on the Glassdoor platform looking for other jobs. So we actually find that there's a 40% increase in the number of layoff survivors who apply for jobs on Glassdoor in the 12 months after a layoff. And that number is actually even higher. This blue line here, that number is even higher for folks that we identify as quote unquote talent, which we think are high performers. So again, this is the context for all of this is, what do workers want? Well, in this current environment where there is a lot of uncertainty, there are these layoffs, there is a lot of anxiety around it, they want stability, they want security, they want some reassurance that they are not going to be they are not going to have to wait for the next shoe to drop, right? And especially in this context, if we're getting these repeated trickle layoffs happening over time, then that's absolutely what they don't want. Okay, so next, I'm going to talk a little bit about AI because it is 2026 and I have to talk about AI. So I think this is really interesting in Glassdoor data because if you asked professionals what they think about AI, sorry, the title there got shrunk a little bit, but if you can't read it, it says, if you ask professionals, a little bit more than half of professionals on Glassdoor said that AI adoption has made them question their long-term job security. Almost 3 in 4 feel pressured to learn new skills. About 3 in 5 of mentions of AI in Glassdoor reviews are negative. So clearly, if you ask people what their opinion is about about AI and what do workers want from AI, well, they get pretty stressed. They get anxious. They don't particularly love the idea of AI coming in and stealing or significantly disrupting their jobs. But this is, again, I think another opportunity to talk about like, okay, well, how much of this is hype noise versus what's real? Because if you ask people, you get one response, but is AI actually at the top of mind of workers? It turns out less than 1% of Glassdoor reviews actually mention AI-related keywords, which was shocking to me when I started doing this analysis, because I assumed that everybody here has probably talked about AI with with a classmate or with a coworker. But it turns out if you actually look at Glassdoor reviews, it's really not at the top of mind for workers. Instead, people talk about pay, they talk about benefits, they talk about work-life balance, talk about culture. But they're not. If you ask people like kind of what is making you anxious, AI is not really at the top of the list. And this kind of bears out in some of the other data that you see in terms of studies that show, oh, well, there's not really evidence that AI is impacting hiring quite yet. There are only a small handful of studies that really seem to be measuring an impact on hiring, and they tend to be very, very narrowly focused on this specific slice of workers, maybe age like 22 to 25 in these industries that are highly exposed, right? Which is a very, very narrow slice of workers. Obviously, it's a relevant slice, but it is very difficult to measure an impact on a group that small. And in fact, we tried to do a similar analysis on Glassdoor data where we looked at occupations that are highly exposed to AI and compared their employee satisfaction versus occupations that are not highly exposed to AI. And there's basically a negligible difference in employee satisfaction trends over the last few years. There's a caveat here that I don't think that this methodology is particularly strong because it's just very difficult to say what is actually a highly exposed AI occupation. But at the very least, we aren't seeing signs of a dramatic shift. And we've actually, we don't have this published, but we actually did a similar analysis on salaries. And again, we don't really see an impact on salaries for high AI exposure occupations versus low. So the boring take here is that AI is not really having a huge impact on what workers want. And that's kind of shown in some of the very limited macroeconomic impact, or that is, I guess, not showing up in the data. In terms of what workers want, though, I think there are some lessons here in terms of what will come in the future, because we do think, and we do think that AI is going to have a big impact in the future, right? It could potentially have these large disruptions to how we work, what skills are important, what jobs are available. And so some lessons that I would take away here, I think for one, again, we have to separate the hype from what is real. The prompt engineer example, I think, is a great one where if anybody is telling you this is the skill you need to learn to be ready for AI, it's probably because they're selling you a course on that AI skill. So there has to be a little bit of humility in recognizing that AI is rapidly changing and the capabilities are rapidly changing. And so we shouldn't necessarily peg ourselves into one specific skill or one specific area because it might change down the line. I think another area of lessons here, which is more for employers and more for leaders, is bringing employees along with AI. Really important as well. There are a lot of workers who are very skeptical of AI. That was the first slide in this section, right? There are a lot of people who are anxious about it. And so it is really important for employers and managers and leaders to really look at how to train workers, how to make sure that they feel like there is an opportunity for them to continue to grow in this AI world. I actually think a great example of this is we had a collaborator, Jason Socken at Cornell, who did an interesting analysis on interview reviews in Glassdoor data. And he was looking at what makes somebody more likely or less likely to accept a job offer. And one thing that he found was that, okay, if you give somebody a skills test in the interview process, they're actually more likely to accept the job offer. And that kind of makes them people want to feel like they are actually being evaluated on the things that are important to the job. One counterexample is that if you give people an IQ test or like one of these psychometric tests that became popular maybe 10, 20 years ago, people are actually less likely to accept a job offer because they get kind of annoyed when they get subjected to this random like test where, I don't know, they're matching shapes together or something, and they're like, what the heck does this have to do with marketing? I have no idea. So if you're a manager or a leader and you're thinking about maybe some of these tools that like look at people's that does like AI video interviews, right? I think a lot of these products advertise the idea that they can tell you something about how the person's like presentation impacts like their readiness for the job. And who knows, maybe it is actually true that like if my mouth twitches every 3 seconds, that of my ability to be like a marketer, maybe that's true. But if you don't actually reveal that information to the candidate, if you aren't transparent with them, if you don't bring them along, if you don't give them feedback, they're going to be pretty annoyed to find out that they got rejected because their mouth twitched 3 times or 2 times or whatever it is, right? Okay, so that's that for AI. Next section, I'll breeze through really quickly on. It's just like side hustles, I think is another buzzy term. I think this is a really interesting kind of like unexplored area. Side hustles are quite common. So about 40% of workers do say that they have some sort of side hustle to supplement their income. That's much higher for younger workers. Again, I don't think that's necessarily a generational difference, but it has more to do with the fact that younger workers might need additional income to supplement their finances, or they might be more willing to take risks. But I think this is a really interesting space, especially in relation to AI, because, and this chart, apologies, there's a lot of going on here. This chart, it shows business applications. It's from the Census Bureau. And you can see that blue line at the top, that the number of business applications absolutely skyrocketed during COVID and remains very high. And the orange line at the bottom, which is a little bit hard to see, is business applications specifically with planned wages. So those are business applications where the applicant indicates that they're basically planning to hire somebody and pay them. And you see this divergence where that orange line is basically back to normal, in fact, maybe a little bit lower, where that blue line continues to increase. And that blue line, in large part, is higher because of some of these online businesses, like maybe like an Etsy store, for example. So I think this is really interesting in the context of like AI, for example, in terms of some of these small like non-employers, where I'm sure, folks in this room, you've probably talked to a friend who says like, oh, I just coded an app using Claude Code or something. And, I have this like personalized app that does exactly what I want it to do. I have a friend who told me that they basically made their own exercise tracking app that perfectly fit their needs. They're never going to sell that because it's just for them. But because there's this lower barrier to entry now, creating software, to creating highly personalized niche software, you might have you have this like kind of unexplored question about what does the future look like for entrepreneurship? Are you going to have a lot of these small businesses that don't really employ anybody? What kind of impact does that have on medium players, large size players that have their market share eaten? So kind of an unexplored question. So I'm going to wrap up here with just one more slide and then open it up to questions. So I think the final takeaways that I would have, there are kind of 3 things that I would point to. One is, again, going back to that framing question, what is different this time versus what is the same? I do think that workers want the same 4 things, right? They still want a healthy culture. They want career opportunities, both in the sense that they want opportunities to grow their skills, to have opportunities for promotion, as well as protection against downside risk. We talked about layoffs, we talked about stability. I think there are a lot of workers who obviously would want some protection on the downside for career growth. And they also want leaders that give them confidence, that are emotionally intelligent, that really they can believe in. There are some things that are different about the current situation that will need new paradigms. So we talked about AI, we talked about remote work, and I think that these are absolutely places where employers and leaders are not yet caught up to the best practices here and the ways that we will need to bring along workers. And then the last thing I'll mention is that we just are in a highly uncertain environment. And so in that context, flexibility, adaptability, those are incredibly important. And I think that's true at all levels of the job market. So for businesses, obviously, they need to be prepared for everything, but also for workers as well. As we think about skill development, it's important not to get locked into one particular area, but instead to think about, okay, how can I take initiative and be a self-starter and learn this new space or learn this new skill when I encounter a roadblock? Like those kinds of skills around flexibility and adaptability are going to continue to remain important. So yeah, that's it for the slides. You can find our research at glassdoor.com/research. And yeah, I'll open it up to questions very shortly.
Well, thank you. Can we all give a round of applause? Thank you. We should give him a double a round of applause. You didn't miss a beat with the tech. And it was like, I was impressed. So let's take some questions, and then I'm going to pull us to close. So do we have somebody in the back too? Am I the only one with the mic that is going in and out? Okay, we have 2 minutes. So I'll start here and then we'll work.
Hi, thank you. Up front. Curious to know kind of if there's data or what the trends are on when folks are laid off, how long it's taking them to get another job. Because anecdotally, I know folks who it seems that it's taking longer, but that may just be another buzzword.
Yeah, there is actually a data series that the Bureau of Labor Statistics publishes, and it does show that there is this lengthening how long it takes people to get back into work. And so that's something we didn't necessarily talk about when we were talking about layoffs, but one of the reasons that people might be more anxious about layoffs in this environment is because it is harder to get back into work once they've been laid off.
Did you already give the mic to somebody? Thank you.
Hi, Eliza Hetrick with Aerotech. I'm curious, when you showed way in the beginning of the presentation, Glassdoor's Employee Confidence Index, it was interesting to me that the years 2020, it stayed above 50 and it only fluctuated. Does your research or do you have your own thoughts around what is different about today's uncertain economy that's causing the uncertainty or confidence to tank versus COVID when it seemed like uncertainty was at an all-time high?
Yeah, that's a great question. So unfortunately, some of the answer to that is some of that is a little bit mechanical. So during COVID, data collection was really hard in the same way that it is for government surveys or in a similar way. So we actually saw that there was a big drop in survey responses, and we think a lot of that came from folks who were laid off and were understandably focused on the pandemic rather than leaving Glassdoor reviews. But I think there are some lessons that we can take away from that period. So one of the things that I think is interesting, if you look at reviews from that time period, is that people actually gave a lot of grace to employers and to leaders. There were a lot of reviews that you would read that would say, hey, I got laid off, but I totally get it. I loved my experience at the company. I understand that there's a global pandemic and we don't know what's going on. And then conversely, like talking about how leaders communicate, there's a lot of discussion around like, my leaders were really transparent. They were really honest in saying, we don't know what's going on, but we're going to get through it together. And so I think that there were some lessons there that can be brought to the present or are juxtaposed against the present, where I feel like leaders are a lot less honest today about what's going on and why they're making those decisions. And that juxtaposition, I think, makes the difference a lot harsher.
Thank you.
Hi there. I actually had a follow-up on very similar questions around the confidence. I also noticed there was another interesting correlation between the higher employee confidence. I think it was about 55 in 2022, which was also when there was the spike in the Great Resignation. So I was curious if there was any correlation that you all had looked into as to why when folks are having a positive look, maybe more or less likely to then resign new company, and what does that mean for the lower confidence today and there's a high labor participation rate, is that they want to be working? It's not that they don't want to be working, but do they want to be working where they are? Or are they too nervous to resign?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the Employee Confidence Index definitely kind of incorporates a few different ideas, right? So not only is it the employee's sense of how the business is doing, but it also ties in how the economy is doing overall. And some of that is, directly related. If the economy is doing well, the business is probably doing well. But some of it might be just like kind of the employees like thinking like, okay, well, I hear that the economy is doing well, and so I feel more optimistic as a result. In terms of like how that's actually impacting behavior, one thing we do very clearly see is that people who are more satisfied with their job, they have higher confidence, those workers are less likely to look for a new job. So there is kind of this macro trend where, is it economic outlook, is it business outlook, who knows? But from a micro perspective, we do see that workers who are less satisfied are more likely to look for a new job, and vice versa, as you would anticipate. I think as you look at more recent data, one thing that we actually want to look at is to see how that's changed. Has the relationship broken down where people who are less satisfied now are they still probably are more likely to look for a job, but maybe that gap is a little bit smaller because they recognize there aren't a lot of opportunities right now.
Thank you.
Hi there, I'm Kyle Gasway. I'm a second year MBA student. And I think just as we're in the business school and thinking about MBAs going into the job market, I was curious if your data had any more information about the types of roles that are being available, especially I know with AI, it seemed like a lot of either the entry level or even that mid-manager level roles are starting to decline. So I wonder if your data supported that.
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think there are a few ways to tackle this. I'd say from an industry perspective, there are certain industries that are doing better. So like healthcare is kind of the obvious example where healthcare is very resilient to business cycle to grow pretty resiliently, I suppose. On an occupational level or a seniority level, I think there's a little bit less evidence that there's a direct impact from AI. We do know that there are fewer entry-level jobs available, but is that because of the business cycle? Is that because businesses overhired in the past? Is it because of AI? That's a little bit less clear. So it's, I don't know if that really like directly addressed your question, but I think from an industry perspective, at least, like healthcare is kind of an industry that has been doing very well. And then, of course, it varies a lot by geography, right? You have some parts of the country that are doing much better than others.
Thank you.
I'm gonna call out that side because I feel like I've been over here a lot. And this called a slightly cold call. Is there anybody that I've missed over here on the hand? There you go. See, as long as you give somebody a chance.
This is all awesome reporting. Thank you so much for your time today and all of this. If you could shed some light on the context of the data that you guys gather to create these reports. Who is on Glassdoor? What type of demographics? What industries are more prevalent than others to kind of give context to these stories?
Yeah, so it's a great question. So Glassdoor does tend to skew more towards white collar industries and white collar occupations. I didn't label everywhere, but some of those data sets are reweighted. Like the Employee Confidence Index is reweighted across industry to try to be more nationally representative. Some of the data sets are not. But in general, our data does tend to skew a little bit more towards white collar workers, a little bit more towards workers who care a lot about information, right? So some of that is because of the industry or occupation, but some people just care a lot more about the culture of the company that they want to work for and that sort of thing.
Is there a gender difference?
There was a question about, is there a gender difference? Generally speaking, I would say not actually. Like, there's not really a huge gender difference. There is some because of industry, so tech tends to be more leaning more towards men. But if you're accounting for that, there doesn't tend to be that much of a difference between men and women.
Thanks for your presentation. I had a quick question about what you presented on remote working and the trends that you were showing that job satisfaction and opportunities to advance are declining for remote workers and hybrid workers. but people still prefer to do that. How is that? Do you see that flipping in the future? And also, do you see anything in your data about efforts by employers to lure employees back to the office with amenities or whatnot, or forcing them back to the office, and how's that landing with your participants?
Yeah, I think we don't necessarily get a lot of direct evidence of like what employers are doing to force people back to the office or encourage people back to the office. But I think that that chart is sort of implicitly showing the consequences of that behavior, where employers are tightening the screws a little bit on workers, and as a result, workers are seeing less job satisfaction. There's less career growth opportunities because they're being forced to choose between a flexible work or career growth or these other factors behind their job. I do think that a lot of that is cyclical. I do think that structurally there has been this shift towards remote work, and that is going to continue to be a major part of how we work moving forward. There is also a longer term discussion about what happens when some of these smaller companies that really benefit from remote work start to take market share or employee share, quote unquote, from some of the larger incumbent players who haven't figured out how to make remote work work. So that's much more of a longer term discussion. Like, I don't think that the remote working startups are going to suddenly overnight take market share from everybody. But that is, I do think that remote work is going to continue to remain a staple of the job market moving forward, even if there is a little bit of a cyclical downturn.
And we're going to take one last question.
Thanks for your talk. So I know you mentioned the idea that AI is kind of leveling the playing field for entrepreneurs. It's never been easier to build something and sell it. I've also heard this other idea where the window to kind of build generational wealth is closing. You have a lot of big tech CEOs kind of saying this idea, the increase of the productivity of labor is going up, and this wealth is just kind of going to the top. So have you seen any kind of data around that or those ideas?
I think it's hard to predict exactly how things will play out for AI. I think the idea that there is an increasing amount of concentration of power is definitely a concern with AI, especially if you think that the result is going to be that these big players, these large AI like frontier labs, are really going to control like a lot of the spaces that are dependent on AI. And part of that conversation is actually going back to something you asked at the beginning of the question, where you said it's never been easier to create software or create a business and sell something. I would say it's never been easier to create a product. I would not necessarily say it's never been easier to sell something, right? Like it's easy to create an app or something, but because it's so easy to create these apps nowadays, you have a lot more competition. It's not a guarantee that you'll actually be able to make money. At the same time, I was talking to a software engineer, a friend of a friend, who made the very extreme case that it only makes sense right now to work at one of the AI frontier labs or at a startup. If you're in the middle, you're getting your lunch eaten by both sides. I think that is a very extreme argument. I don't know if I would go quite that far, but I think there is something to be said for the idea that all of the incumbent players in the middle are being disrupted. They really have to figure out how to deal with AI. There's a lot of startups where it's going to be hard to say which of those startups is actually going to win, but chances are there's going to be one or some of those players who manage to disrupt an incumbent in each of their respective fields.
And that sounds like a great debate for research as we move forward, right? That's what we do here. Is it's not one or the other, about sort of these different mindsets and coming together and debating them, not knowing which one is actually going to ultimately be proven right, if we think about it that way. Can we all give wrap